Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
How does this, 3-pound universe sitting inside your head actually create the feeling of being you? Right now, experiencing this moment, it's a huge question.
It really is, and scientists have been chasing this for decades, trying to find what they call the neural correlates of consciousness, basically the specific brain activity that matches up with our subjective experience.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into some really fascinating, pretty large-scale research that tackled this head-on.
Yeah, this wasn't just, another small study. It was designed specifically to compare two of the biggest players, two major theories trying to explain consciousness: integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory.
Exactly. And listeners should care because this gets right to the core of how we perceive everything, how our own awareness works. It touches on, fundamental questions about our own minds.
Right. And the source we're looking at today is quite something. It was published in a major scientific journal, and the researchers called it an adversarial collaboration.
Adversarial. What does that mean in this context?
It means the people who actually came up with these competing theories, the main proponents, worked together with other scientists who were, let's say, theory neutral. They all got together to design the study.
Ah, okay. So proponents and neutral researchers all designing it together before they collected any data. That sounds unusual.
It is, and it's a huge strength. They agreed beforehand on what each theory predicted, how they'd measure brain activity using things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, magnetoencephalography, and even intracranial electroencephalography.
Wow, multiple heavy-hitting techniques. On lots of people too, right?
Yeah, large numbers for each method. And they even agreed on how they'd interpret the results, the pass-fail criteria. The whole idea was to minimize bias as much as possible.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack what this big collaborative study found. What does it tell us about these two big theories, integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory, and sort of where does that leave our understanding of consciousness?
That's the plan. Let's get into it.
All right, so let's start with the theories themselves. First up, integrated information theory. What's the core idea there in simple terms?
Well, the gist of integrated information theory, or IIT, is that consciousness is fundamentally about the brain's ability to influence itself. It's an intrinsic property. They even have a mathematical measure for it called phi, though we don't need to get bogged down in that.
Okay, the brain influencing itself. And where does it think this happens mainly?
IIT proposes that the crucial area is in the back of the brain, the posterior cortex. Specifically, a region sometimes called the temporoparieto-occipital hot zone. Think areas involved in processing what you see, where things are in space, that kind of sensory integration.
Got it. Posterior hot zone. Now, what about the other one? Global neuronal workspace theory. How does that explain consciousness?
Global neuronal workspace theory, or GNWT, has a different take. It suggests consciousness happens when information becomes globally available, like it's broadcast across a network of higher-level brain regions.
Broadcast, like on a stage.
Sort of, yeah. They talk about an ignition moment, where information is amplified and shared across areas like higher-order sensory regions, parietal cortex, and especially the prefrontal cortex. That's the bit at the very front of your head involved in planning, decision-making, working memory.
So IIT focuses on integrated information in the back. GNWT focuses on a global broadcast involving the front. And this study set out to test them against each other using that adversarial collaboration you mentioned.
Exactly. That collaboration was key. Proponents of both theories, plus neutral scientists, hammering out the experimental design together. It really aimed for fairness.
To avoid anyone just, finding evidence for their own pet theory.
Precisely. And they didn't just agree on the design, they pre-registered everything. The specific predictions each theory made for this experiment, the exact criteria for judging if a prediction held up, what results they expected, and how they'd interpret different outcomes before they saw a single data point.
It's proper scientific rigor right there, minimizing bias. Okay, so what did people actually do in this experiment?
It was a visual task. Participants basically watched a screen where images popped up briefly. These images could be faces, objects, letters, or even false fonts, things that look like letters but aren't real.
Okay, just watch images.
Well, they had a task. They were shown images for different lengths of time, half a second, 1 second, 1.5 seconds. And before a block of trials, they were told to look out for specific target images, like maybe a specific face or a specific object.
Okay. And did they vary other things about the images too?
They did. Four main things. One was the category, as we said, face, object, letter, false font. Second was the specific identity within the category, so not just face, but which face. Third was the orientation, was the face looking straight, left or right. And fourth, as you said, was the duration it was shown.
Lots of variables. And you mentioned task-relevant versus task-irrelevant things. What was that about?
Right. So in any given block, participants might be told, okay, press a button if you see this face or this object. Those categories, faces, and objects would be task relevant for that block. The other categories, letters and false fonts, would be task irrelevant.
And this changed.
Yeah, it switched across blocks. But crucially, one thing was always task irrelevant: the orientation. Whether the face looked left or right didn't matter for their task.
I see. So they could try to disentangle brain activity related to just seeing something consciously from activity related purely to doing the task. Clever. And they use those three different brain imaging methods.
Yes, the functional magnetic resonance imaging for good spatial where information, the magnetoencephalography for precise temporal when information, and the intracranial electroencephalography, those electrodes directly in the brain, for some patients giving really fine-grained local signals. And they collected data across multiple labs for each method to make sure the findings were robust.
Okay, so they had to set up the task, the imaging. What were the specific predictions they were testing? Based on the two theories. There were three main ones, right?
Correct. Three key pre-registered predictions. The first was about decoding conscious content. Where in the brain could they best figure out what the person was consciously seeing, the category, and the orientation?
And the predictions were?
IIT predicted decoding would be strongest in the posterior cortex, that hot zone. GNWT, on the other hand, really emphasized the prefrontal cortex as being essential for conscious content to be broadcast.
Okay, prediction one.
Yeah.
Location of content. What was number two?
Number two was about how conscious content is maintained over time. How does the brain hold on to the experience? IIT predicted sustained activity. If you see something for a second, the activity in that posterior hot zone should stay high for that whole second.
Makes sense. And GNWT.
GNWT predicted a different pattern. A brief burst of activity, that ignition in the prefrontal cortex when the image first appears, and then, importantly, another brief burst when it disappears. The idea was the information might be held in a sort of latent state in between, but conscious access required these ignition events, including one to signal the end of the percept.
So sustained in the back for IIT versus brief on and off bursts in the front for GNWT. Got it. And the third prediction?
The third was about connectivity, how different brain areas talk to each other to support consciousness. Both theories had ideas about this, but predicted different patterns of synchronization between regions. IIT specifically predicted sustained synchronized activity within the posterior network. GNWT's predictions involved connectivity patterns related to that global broadcast, likely involving the prefrontal cortex.
Right. Location, timing, connections. Three clear points of comparison. So let's get to the results. What did they actually find? Starting with decoding, where can they read out what people saw?
Okay, so the results here were interesting. They found they could decode information about the image category and also its orientation from both the posterior regions and the prefrontal cortex.
Both. So kind of supporting both theories a bit.
On the surface, maybe. But here's the crucial part. When they looked closer, they found that once you had the information from the posterior cortex, adding the information from the prefrontal cortex usually didn't make the decoding any better. Sometimes it even made it slightly worse.
Okay, that changes things. So the prefrontal cortex wasn't adding unique information about the content, at least not beyond what was already in the back.
Exactly. Which is, a bit challenging for the GNWT view that the prefrontal cortex is where conscious content is. It aligns maybe a bit better with IIT, which sees the posterior cortex as primary, although IIT didn't strictly forbid PFC involvement.
So maybe the prefrontal cortex reflects the broadcast, but doesn't hold the original detailed content itself.
That's one way to think about it, yeah. And adding to that, they found that decoding the orientation of the image left, right, front was pretty clear in the posterior cortex, but almost non-existent in the prefrontal cortex. That's another tricky point for GNWT's emphasis on the prefrontal workspace, holding the conscious content.
Okay, interesting findings on the where. What about the when, the maintenance over time? Did they see sustained activity or those ignition bursts?
Here, the results seem to lean more towards IIT. They found evidence for sustained activity in the posterior cortex that tracked the duration of the stimulus. So if the image was on screen for 1.5 seconds, that posterior activity related to the image category tended to stay elevated for that time.
That sounds like pretty direct support for the IoT prediction, doesn't it?
It does seem that way. It aligns well with their idea of sustained representation in the posterior hot zone.
And what about the GNWT prediction? The ignition bursts in the prefrontal cortex, especially the one when the stimulus turned off.
Well, that's where GNWT ran into a significant hurdle in this study. They generally didn't find that predicted burst of activity, that ignition, in the prefrontal cortex when the stimulus disappeared.
Really? No off-switch signal in the prefrontal cortex?
Not consistently, no. They did sometimes see activity when the stimulus appeared in onset response, but the lack of a reliable offset response, that second ignition burst predicted by GNWT to mark the end of the conscious percept, was a major finding against that specific aspect of the theory.
Wow, okay. That seems like a fairly direct contradiction of a key prediction.
It does. It raises big questions about how GNWT accounts for the termination of a conscious experience, at least via that specific prefrontal mechanism.
Did they see that onset-offset pattern anywhere else? The study mentioned something about that.
Yes, interestingly, they did observe that kind of pattern activity at onset and offset in some electrodes located in earlier visual processing areas, like the striate and extrastriate cortex, not the prefrontal cortex where GNWT predicted the workspace ignition.
So maybe that pattern is more about basic visual processing ending, rather than the global conscious workspace shutting down.
That's a possibility, yeah. It suggests that specific temporal pattern might not be the signature of the global workspace itself.
Okay, so for maintenance, sustained posterior activity leans towards IIT. Lack of prefrontal offset ignition is tough for GNWT. What about the third piece, the connectivity between brain areas?
The connectivity results were also complex. They did find some evidence for synchronization, especially in lower frequency brainwaves, between areas that process specific categories like face areas and both early visual cortex and the prefrontal cortex.
So some communication happening.
Yes, some selective communication. This could potentially fit with aspects of both theories, information being shared.
But IIT had that specific prediction about sustained synchrony within the posterior hot zone, right? Was that found?
That's the key challenge for IIT from the connectivity results. They generally did not find strong evidence for that kind of sustained synchronization purely within the posterior cortex itself.
So the specific mechanism IIT proposed for how consciousness is held together by ongoing posterior network communication wasn't really supported by the data here.
That's what the findings suggest, yeah. It represents a direct challenge to that core claim about connectivity specifying consciousness in IIT. The brief connectivity they did see between prefrontal and sensory areas during the stimulus might align a bit with GNWT's broadcast idea, but again, it wasn't the specific sustained posterior pattern IIT predicted.
Man, this is really nuanced. It seems like neither theory came out completely unscathed.
Right.
Were there any limitations acknowledged by the researchers themselves, things we should keep in mind?
Oh, absolutely. Every study has limitations. They noted that even though they tried hard to separate consciousness from the task itself using those irrelevant features, they couldn't completely rule out that some of the brain activity, especially for the stimulus category, might still be influenced by general task engagement.
Okay, so a potential confound, though maybe less so for orientation and duration.
Probably less so for those, yes, since they were always task irrelevant. They also pointed out that, while they measured several aspects like category and orientation, it's still a simplified version of the rich, full, what it's like feeling of consciousness. It doesn't capture everything.
Fair enough. It's hard to capture qualia in a scanner.
Exactly. And finally, because it was mainly human research, they mostly relied on non-invasive methods like fMRI and MEG, plus the intracranial EEG from patients who had electrodes for clinical reasons. They didn't have, say, single neuron recordings across the whole brain like you might get in animal studies, which could offer finer detail. They did mention ongoing animal work might help clarify things further.
Right, important context.
Yeah.
So bringing it all together, what was the overall conclusion from the theory-neutral scientists in this adversarial group? Based on those pre-agreed criteria, what were the main takeaways for IIT and GNWT?
Okay, so the neutral consortium looked at the pre-registered predictions and the data. For integrated information theory, the big challenge was the lack of observed, sustained synchronization within the posterior cortex. That hits at a really core part of the theory about how consciousness is supposedly maintained by this intrinsic connectivity.
So the connectivity prediction didn't pan out as expected for IIT. What about global neuronal workspace theory?
For GNWT, the main challenges were firstly the absence of that predicted ignition burst in the prefrontal cortex when the stimulus disappeared. That offset signal was a key prediction. And secondly, while prefrontal cortex did show activity related to the stimulus category, it showed very limited representation of other conscious features like the specific identity or the orientation. This raises questions about how much of the detailed conscious content is actually represented or broadcast by the prefrontal workspace, as the theory suggests.
So significant challenges for both sides, based on their own pre-agreed benchmarks. Did the original proponents of IIT and GNWT get a chance to respond within the paper?
Yes, they did. The published paper actually includes sections where the IIT team offers their interpretation of the findings and suggests future directions, and the GNWT team does the same. They obviously interpret things through the lens of their own theories and point to ways the theories might be refined or how future experiments could address the discrepancies.
That seems fair. So it sounds like this study wasn't a knockout blow for either theory, but it definitely landed some significant punches and has given everyone a lot to think about.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. Its real strength wasn't necessarily in crowning a winner, but in the incredibly rigorous approach that adversarial design, forcing clear predictions and then testing them robustly. It's moved the empirical study of consciousness forward significantly.
So for you, listening to this, trying to grasp this really complex field, what's the main message to take away?
I'd say the key takeaway is that even though these findings challenge major parts of both leading theories, that's actually progress. We now have much richer data and clearer points of contention that can be used to refine these theories, or perhaps even develop entirely new ones that better account for all the evidence.
So the picture is getting clearer, even if it's more complicated than either theory initially proposed.
Exactly. It just highlights how incredibly complex the brain is, and how difficult it is to pin down the neural basis of something as seemingly simple, yet profoundly mysterious as our own awareness.
Okay, before we wrap up, what's one final thought you want to leave our listeners chewing on? Something provocative.
Well, just think about your own experience right now. Maybe shift your attention from listening to my voice to, say, the feeling of your feet on the floor or something you see in the room. That simple voluntary shift in what you are conscious of. How might that relate to this complex dance between brain regions we've been talking about? Reflecting on how even that basic act of focusing your awareness could involve the kinds of posterior representations and perhaps broader network communication this research explored, it makes you realize that understanding these seemingly small shifts might be key to unlocking the really big mystery of consciousness itself.
That's a great point to ponder. It connects this high-level science right back to our moment-to-moment experience.
Yeah.
And of course, if you are really keen to get into the weeds.
Yeah, the original research paper is out there. It's dense, but it has all the details of the methods, the full results, and those interpretations from the different theory proponents. Definitely worth a look if you want the deepest dive possible.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.